and welcome. I am Ramesh Ramachandran and this is News Night, your one-stop destination for news and analysis. It's just after 9 p.m. in New Delhi, where Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi hosts a virtual summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. 6:30 in the evening in Jenin, in the occupied West Bank, where at least 10 people are dead after Israel carries out its biggest military operation in decades. We'll have more on that in just a bit. And 8:30 in the morning in San Francisco in the US, where Meta, which owns Facebook, WhatsApp and Instagram, is all set to launch a Twitter-like app called Threads. It's good to see you this Tuesday, 4th July. I'm glad you could join us. All right, on the show tonight, Iran becomes the 9th member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization after India, China, Russia, Pakistan and 4 Central Asian countries. New Delhi summit agrees to start the process of making Belarus an SCO member. India raises the issues of terrorism, Afghanistan and connectivity. Prime Minister Modi says better connectivity not only enhances trade but also fosters mutual trust. But he also asks in the same breath, is SCO future ready as an organization? That's a top focus. Plus news and updates from around the world, all that and much more coming up over the next 1 hour. But first, as always, the headlines. India hosts SCO summit. Prime Minister Narendra Modi slams double standard on terror, says connectivity projects should respect a country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. UN nuclear watchdog allows Japan to release treated radioactive water from Fukushima plant into the ocean despite resistance from China. Prime Minister Kishida Fumio promises transparency in sharing scientific evidence. Two separate incidents of mass shooting in the US on the eve of its Independence Day. 5 killed and 2 injured in the city of Philadelphia. 3 dead and 8 wounded in the state of Texas. NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg gets a 4th extension to remain on the post for another year. The Norwegian leader has headed the transatlantic military alliance since 2014. Thousands of Palestinians flee a camp in Jenin as Israel carries out a major military operation in the occupied West Bank. The UK calls for UN Security Council expansion. British diplomat says India should become a permanent UNSC member, besides Brazil, Germany, Japan, and representation from the African continent. A summer heat leaves people in Cuba's capital, Havana, without water. Tensions rise as government scrambles for a solution. And in sport, India faces Kuwait in the South Asian Football Federation Championship final at a sold-out Kantirva Stadium in Bengaluru. India eyes a 9th title. So those were the headlines. Let's get started and I will dive straight into our cover story. India hosts the 23rd SCO summit virtually. Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping were among those who took part in it. It was the first time Putin attended a global summit since the Wagner Group staged a mutiny in Russia in June. Now, New Delhi's hosting of the event comes just 2 weeks after the US rolled out the red carpet for Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi as he was hosted by US President Joe Biden for a state visit.
Addressing the summit, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi said the SCO should join hands to fight terrorism and not hesitate to condemn countries that support terror.
आतंकवाद चाहे किसी भी रूप में हो, किसी भी अभिव्यक्ति में हो, हमें इसके विरुद्ध मिलकर लड़ाई करनी होगी। कुछ देश क्रॉस बॉर्डर टेररिज्म को अपनी नीतियों के इंस्ट्रूमेंट के रूप में इस्तेमाल करते हैं, आतंकवादियों को पनाह देते हैं। एससीओ को ऐसे देशों की आलोचना में कोई संकोच नहीं करना चाहिए।
PM Modi urged leaders of the Eurasian political and security grouping to work for the welfare of Afghanistan and provide humanitarian aid to Kabul. He said Afghan soil should not be allowed to be used to destabilize its neighborhood.
अफगान नागरिकों को मानवीय सहायता, एक समावेशी सरकार का गठन, आतंकवाद और ड्रग तस्करी के विरुद्ध लड़ाई तथा महिलाओं, बच्चों और अल्पसंख्यकों के अधिकारों को सुनिश्चित करना हमारी साझा प्राथमिकताएं हैं।
PM Modi said India supports proposal for reform and modernization of the SCO.
हमें मिलकर यह विचार करना चाहिए कि क्या हम एक संगठन के रूप में हमारे लोगों की अपेक्षाओं और आकांक्षाओं को पूरा करने में समर्थ है। क्या हम आधुनिक चुनौतियों का सामना करने में सक्षम हैं? क्या एससीओ एक ऐसा संगठन बन रहा है जो भविष्य के लिए पूरी तरह से तैयार हो? इस विषय में भारत एससीओ में सुधार और आधुनिकीकरण के प्रस्ताव का समर्थन करता है।
PM Modi also said countries need to respect territorial integrity.
किसी भी क्षेत्र की प्रगति के लिए मजबूत कनेक्टिविटी का होना बहुत ही आवश्यक है। बेहतर कनेक्टिविटी आपसी व्यापार ही नहीं, आपसी विश्वास भी बढ़ाती है। किंतु इन प्रयासों में एससीओ चार्टर के मूल सिद्धांतों, विशेष रूप से सदस्य देशों की संप्रभुता और क्षेत्रीय अखंडता का सम्मान करना बहुत ही आवश्यक है।
Iran has formally become an SCO member. The New Delhi summit welcomed the signing of a memorandum of obligation for the SCO membership of Belarus. SCO leaders adopted the New Delhi Declaration and two thematic joint statements. India's Foreign Secretary Vinay Mohan Kwatra said the two statements pertain to cooperation in countering radicalization leading to separatism, extremism and terrorism, and cooperation in field of digital transformation.
Essentially, set of outcomes that are aimed at furthering the cooperation among the SCO member states, secure standing for security, economic development, connectivity, unity, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, and environmental protection.
Kazakhstan will host the next SCO summit. Bureau Report, DD India.
Before I bring in my guests, I want to quickly go across to my colleagues in New Delhi and Moscow. Amritpal Singh will join me from New Delhi, and also joining me from Moscow is Dasha Chernyshyova. Dasha, if you can hear me, President Putin in his speech spoke about how sanctions are making Russia stronger. He also spoke about Afghanistan. How would you sum up Putin's address to the summit? All right, I'm told we have lost that link with Dasha Chernyshyova in Moscow. Let me bring in my guest on the show, Dr. TCA Raghavan. Dr. Raghavan is a former Indian High Commissioner to Pakistan and Singapore. High Commissioner Raghavan, welcome to Newsnight. Good to see you. First off the bat, Ambassador Raghavan, Prime Minister Modi using his address to the summit to touch upon two perennial issues that India has faced over the last many decades now. One, terrorism, cross-border terrorism in particular, which was perhaps hinted at India's neighbor to the west. And he also spoke about connectivity, how connectivity projects must respect a country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And that, I suppose, was meant for India's neighbor to the north. How would you describe or sum up Prime Minister Modi's address to the summit?
Thank you very much. I think the address was a wide-ranging one, and while certainly those 2 points which you mentioned were highlighted, on the whole, what the Prime Minister emphasized was the need for SCO to remain a relevant and robust organization for the times ahead. You will understand that the SCO region as a whole has been through a somewhat turbulent phase in the last 2 or 3 years, with developments in Afghanistan, the war in Ukraine, the recent crisis following, or quote-unquote crisis following the mutiny by the Wagner organization in Russia. So there has been a certain turbulence within the SCO, and to some extent that turbulence was also related to intra-SCO issues such as those between India and China, India and Pakistan, as also other issues between SCO member states. So I think the principal thrust of his address, and which is why it was important that this summit was held and a new member such as Iran has joined, was that SCO must remain as a relevant organization for the region as a whole. Now, certainly terrorism, as you mentioned, has been a traditional point which India has raised with great consistency for many years yet now, as has connectivity. Within SCO itself, India's position on connectivity diverges somewhat from the other member states. All the other member states are partners of the Chinese BRI initiative, on which we have major problems with because of the fact that it infringes on our territorial integrity and raises those conceptual issues. So I would say the Prime Minister, while touching on both these points, has presented an overview of SCO as a multilateral organization and the pressing need for it to remain relevant for the times ahead.
All right, I'm told we have finally made contact with my colleagues Amritpal Singh in New Delhi and Dasha Cherneshova, who is standing by in Moscow. Amrit, to you first. You've covered the summit extensively over the last many months. Now, India in particular this morning raising the issue of countries using terror as an instrument of state policy, and others adopting a double standard on the issue of terrorism as well. So was it an oblique reference to Pakistan and possibly Chinese positions?
Of course, when the Prime Minister says that Pakistan, some countries are using terrorism as an instrument of state policy, and there has to be a holistic approach by the SCO, and its own charter, Article 1 of its own charter, mandates the SCO to act collectively to fight over this menace. He was urging the SCO member states to take a position which discourages all forms of terrorism, be it cross-border terror financing, etc., giving safe havens to terrorism. Not just because India, he was speaking for India. Of course, he was speaking for India as the head of the government of India, but he was also, making a larger point that terrorism not just affects one individual country, but it has the potential of destabilizing the whole region. So that was the larger point that he was making. And also when he spoke about, having double speak, the Chinese actions that we've seen at the UN and other international fora of blocking, resolutions against brought against terrorists who are known to, to be globally designated terrorists or are in the process of being globally designated. So he was trying to say that there is a certain inbuilt doublespeak which has double standards which have to be defeated, and he was urging the organization to come to a consensus, take a cut, not shy away from condemning it. Therefore, having a uniformity of approach towards dealing with the whole issue of terrorism.
Right.
Ramesh?
Right. Ambassador Raghavan, I'll come to you momentarily. Let me go across to my colleague Dasha in Moscow. Dasha, if you can hear me. President Putin in his speech spoke about how sanctions are making Russia stronger. He also spoke about the situation in Afghanistan. How would you describe Putin's address to the summit?
Well, indeed, the Russian president has said that Russia was showing resilience, and despite the pressure from the Western countries, Russia was managing to preserve its economy. Despite all predictions, he said, they did not come true, and Russian economy did not collapse. He also thanked the SCO leaders for their support while Russia was fighting the Wagner armed rebellion almost 2 weeks ago. He said that that was also important for Russia. He also talked about the unity within Russia, saying that the people, the army, and the political elites have all united behind the Russian president. He was sure of it. So definitely the Russian president was talking a lot about the situation in Russia, but also thanking the SCO countries, saying that the organization plays a huge and tremendous role in providing for security in the region, but also saying that SCO can play even larger role. Now, the idea here is the very fact that the countries of SCO are now starting to trade more in the local currencies. He was saying that the trade between Russia and those countries has increased. The idea now is to establish the SCO Development Bank that will be further helping to create the financial infrastructure for the countries within SCO to function and to get away from the dependence on the US dollar.
Indeed. Amrit, coming back to you, India also raised the issue of connectivity. Prime Minister Modi, for one, spoke that it should not impinge on a member state's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Was he alluding to China and Xi Jinping's flagship project, the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yes, I think he was. While the Prime Minister, took the consistent position that India takes, that India is, for regional connectivity when he welcomed Iran, he said that he hoped that Chabahar could emerge to be a point of, transit for connecting the Indian Ocean to the landlocked Central Asian countries, and the immense potential that it throws up. In the same breath, he underlined the point that that cannot be a ploy to impinge upon the territorial integrity and sovereignty of other nations. In fact, the theme of India's chairship of the SCO is secure, of which one element is respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty. The Prime Minister when he made that point in the context of regional connectivity, he clearly was alluding to that if your BRI passes through what India claims to be its territory, which is occupied illegally by Pakistan, and a third country passing through it, India sees it as infringement on its sovereignty. So the Prime Minister used this forum not just to convey this message to Pakistan and China, but to urge the other countries to take a consensus or to look at another point of that while India does not have any in principle opposition to connectivity or projects like BRI, but if they impinge upon our national our territorial integrity, then India surely has a bone to pick with that.
Absolutely. And Dasha, very quickly, the New Delhi summit welcomed Iran as the 9th SCO member. Also, the summit agreed to start the process of accepting or making Belarus an SCO member as well. How does Russia view these developments? What's the mood or sense you're getting in Moscow?
Well, certainly Russia has welcomed Iran's admission to the SCO, and many experts suggest that Iran's membership will benefit the organization, and it also means that the organization has now gone and developed into the Middle East. So certainly there is a lot of development within the organization, but many experts also suggest that this is because the organization is so appealing to those countries. Now, as for Belarus, we understand that the country will be admitted to SCO in the next year's summit. And the Belarusian president has also been saying that he welcomes the initiatives within the framework of the SCO, and he will do everything needed to accomplish that procedure by the time that the country would be able to become the fully fledged member.
All right, on that note, Amrit and Dasha, thank you for your inputs. You were listening to my colleagues Amrit Pal Singh in New Delhi and Dasha Chernyshrova in Moscow. All right, coming back to the discussion at hand, and we are discussing about SCO Summit adopts New Delhi Declaration. And with me still is my guest, Ambassador Raghavan. Ambassador Raghavan, thank you for your patience. If I can also ask you for your comment on the participation of the Pakistani Prime Minister, virtually though, at the SCO Summit. I ask you this because as things stand today, perhaps, and correct me if I'm wrong here, SCO is the only multilateral organization or grouping which has both India and Pakistan as its members, because SAARC is in limbo. So that leaves SCO perhaps the only organization which has both countries as its members. Does it help, or would it help going forward at all?
Well, there are a number of multilateral organizations of which India and Pakistan are both members.
Okay.
The most prominently the United Nations itself, and within the UN family there are many organizations. There's also the Commonwealth, of which both India and Pakistan are members. Is it helpful that India and Pakistan participate together in multilateral organizations? Yes, I think so, because the multilateral dynamic is quite different from the bilateral dynamic. For instance, in the SCO, the organization has to take a decision by consensus. So all countries have to put aside their differences to some extent to come up with a common program of action, which is not to say that differences do not exist. For instance, both India and Pakistan have major differences on terrorism, and our point about Pakistan using terrorism as an instrument of state policy was clearly stated by the Prime Minister, although in oblique terms. But nevertheless, despite these differences, the SCO also takes a position on terrorism, to which Pakistan and India then both become party to. So I would say yes, it is helpful, but certainly membership of an international organization such as SCO doesn't advance in any substantial way the bilateral process.
Fair enough.
If that indeed was your question. The fact that this summit was a virtual one to some extent precluded that possibility of some bilateral movement taking place between India and Pakistan, because the leaders of both countries would happen to be meeting on the sidelines of a multilateral summit.
Fair enough. Let me pause here and also welcome my the other guest, Professor Harsh Pant. Professor Pant is Vice President Studies and Foreign Policy at Observer Research Foundation. The ORF is a privately held think tank headquartered in New Delhi. Professor Pant, if you are with us and can hear me as well. Now, this was the first outing of sorts for Putin after the Wagner episode. Do you think Putin used the SCO forum to send a message across to his critics that, look, here I am among friends, and I'm not as isolated as you claim? In fact, he went on to say that sanctions are actually making Russia stronger.
Yes, indeed. I think every time Mr. Putin has had an opportunity in the last year and a half to come out and speak at such forums and speak with friends, I think that has been an opportunity for him to make that case that he remains in some ways connected to the rest of the world, and that the Western world may think that he's isolated, but that's not the case. And in this particular case, SCO, of course, is something that holds a very privileged position for Russia as a platform which Russia had conceived long back. And has come of age in some ways with its continuous enlargement of its membership. So certainly, I think for Mr. Putin, this is an attempt. This would have been an attempt to showcase his regional leadership and as well as the leadership of this institution, where Russia continues to play a very important role with some very important countries sitting around the table like China, India. Iran now joining, and a whole, the entire array of Central Asian countries. So certainly that point, perhaps after the Wagner episode, this would have, in some ways a message also that he's in control, he's in command, that he has not lost the control over Russia, that whatever the interpretations might be about Wagner and what is happening in Russia, he continues to engage the rest of the world on Russia's behalf, and he continues to convey a sense of authority and predictability and continuity in Russian foreign policy. So I think that message certainly is being conveyed through this, but I think largely this is also about Russia and Putin trying to engage, a platform and the members of that platform on regional security issues, which has always been an important vector in Russian foreign policy. The fact that Central Asia is so important as an extended periphery of Russia, and that the fact that it allows Russia now to link up with countries like India, China, and Iran, that also continues to convey a very, very important message.
At the same time, Professor Pant, the SCO summit comes barely 2 weeks after a high-profile visit by Prime Minister Modi to the US. Does that tell you about India's nimble diplomacy? That Indian diplomacy can straddle various interests simultaneously, and that should hold India in good stead as well?
Certainly, I think to a great extent, India has been able to maintain these independent positions with different partners on a range of issues, which as I think Indian policymakers have said, issue-based coalitions, which are about issue areas and themes that India feels strongly about, where like-minded countries come together and define their partnership on their own terms. So I think. In some ways, India's interests in SCO is slightly different, perhaps, from the interests that Russia, to a certain extent, China have projected, which is slightly more. The tone is anti-Western. So if you see the remarks of the Russian president, or to a certain extent Chinese president, they are largely also attacking the West. Whereas India's interest in SCO is largely about regional security, coming together with regional powers to maintain a sense of stability in Central Asia, and issues around connectivity, trade, commerce in that part of the region, which has remained disconnected from the rest of the world. So in some ways, India's interests are regional, and India would like to continue would like to hope that SCO continues along that direction, and that India's relationship with the West stand on its own terms, which are about issues where India and the West are partnering, and in particular India and the US framing a relationship with each other on the basis of the 21st century realities in the Indo-Pacific. So I think the two are distinct, and the two are contributing to India's foreign policy outreach in their own ways.
Indeed. Ambassador Raghavan, I want to draw your attention to another country in India's extended neighborhood, and I'm speaking specifically about Iran. Iran is the latest member, the 9th member of the SCO. India enjoys traditional ties with that country in terms of connectivity, energy, and other interests as well. Prime Minister Modi, referring to Iran's significance in his address as well, is talking about connectivity, the Chabahar port, and also the international north-south transport corridor as well. Is there a forward movement on both these counts, and that perhaps India is looking at these options as well?
Well, to my mind, one of the most important takeaways from this summit was Iran becoming a full-fledged member of SCO. Now, this is important for a number of reasons, and certainly one of the reasons is the north-south corridor, although admittedly it must be said that while the north-south corridor remains on the table as a principal connectivity axis in the region, it has not really made the kind of progress which was expected. And this is largely to do because of the different sanctions regimes which Iran faces, which makes investment and development of this corridor that much more difficult. So possibly it has not developed as a counterweight to the BRI to the extent that we would have liked. But nevertheless, potentially it remains as a very, very viable connectivity access for the region. I think Iran's membership is also important for other reasons. Firstly, it shows that efforts to isolate Iran, and there has been sustained efforts because of differences between Iran and the US, because of the sanctions which have been imposed on Iran, and for other reasons. Those clearly are now on the wane, because the membership of the SCO suggests that the recent breakthrough in Iran-Saudi Arabia relations also suggests that. So clearly, Iran's profile regionally being on an upstick is a significant development at the current juncture.
Fair enough. On that note, may I thank both my guests, Ambassador Raghavan and Professor Panth, for joining us and sharing your insights with our viewers at home and abroad. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it. Right, and now to some more news we are tracking here on Newsnight. 5 people have been killed and 2 children wounded after a man wearing a bulletproof vest opened fire in the US city of Philadelphia. The suspect, a man believed to be 40 years old, was taken into custody and 3 guns recovered from the scene, including a rifle and a handgun that belonged to the suspect. Philadelphia police chief said 2 suspects were in custody, including the shooter. Another incident of shooting took place in a parking lot in the US state of Texas, which left 3 people dead and 8 wounded just before July the 4th. Now, 1 was pronounced dead on the scene. 2 others died in hospital, while the other 8 were hospitalized. There was a large crowd gathering in the parking lot at the time of the shooting. The reason for the shooting was not immediately clear. 10 victims were adults and the other is a juvenile. Right, so multiple incidents of shooting being reported from the United States, and this to many minds around the world, people agitated by what has happened in Philadelphia and Texas, and before that in Baltimore as well. And this has to many minds reignited debate about gun control and what governments in the US states as well as the federal government can do to prevent such killings, to prevent the loss of innocent lives, including, as was mentioned in those reports, children who were injured in large numbers in the senseless acts of mass shootings. We'll try to get you more, the latest, in fact, from my colleague Nick Harper, who would join us momentarily from Washington, D.C. Nick has been tracking these news for many hours now, and we'll try to get the latest from him on the latest information he can source from the police, the local authorities, and the condition of those wounded or recovering in hospital as well. As reports suggested, the Philadelphia shooter, were given to understand, wore a bulletproof vest. He also sported a rifle, but the motive is not clear yet, and that will be one of the questions that I would like to ask Nick myself if he is finally through to us. We'll try to get you more from Nick, who is, I'm told, is finally with us and will join us momentarily from Washington, D.C. Nick, can you hear me?
I certainly can. Good evening.
Thank you, Nick. Good to see you. And our report suggests that the shooter was found wearing a bulletproof vest and sporting a rifle. What do we know about the shooter's motive?
Well, that's the big question. Police so far have not disclosed the motive. It's not clear if they simply don't know it or if they haven't been able to find it from this 40-year-old suspect. What we do know is that there was a brief chase after the shooting took place. Officers managed to corner him in an alley and he surrendered. So they will have that opportunity to question him, to find out exactly why this shooting took place. But the reporting up until now, the word from the police seems to be suggesting that this was a seemingly random attack, that he turned up on a street in the southwest part of Philadelphia wearing that bulletproof vest, carrying an assault rifle and a handgun, and he then started shooting seemingly randomly around that street, hitting vehicles and people, also shooting dead somebody who was inside a house at the time, the bullets penetrating that property. So police still trying to work out exactly what took place, that investigation continuing.
Also, Nick, the U.S. Independence Day Eve also saw another incident in the state of Texas. There was another one reported from the city of Baltimore as well. Now, have these incidents sort of reignited a debate around gun control? Aren't such incidents happening or becoming all too common in the U.S. as we speak? Could it become an election issue going forward?
Well, we have seen a number of mass shootings over the last few days. That one in Baltimore that you referred to taking place over the weekend, Saturday night into Sunday. About 30 people killed at a block party. 30 people shot at a block party. 2 of them were killed. And then last night, as we headed into the 4th of July Independence Day holiday that the US is currently celebrating, there was a shooting in a parking lot in Fort Worth, Texas. We saw 3 people die in that incident, another 8 of them injured. President Joe Biden has just recently put out a statement about these mass shootings. He's called them tragic and senseless shootings, and he said that much more must be done to address the epidemic of gun violence that is tearing our communities apart. And within that statement, he has once again pushed for a ban on assault weapons. That is something that he has tried to do during his 2.5 years in office, but it's not something that he can do unilaterally on his own. He needs Congress to act to be able to pass an assault rifle ban. It's something that the United States did have. They had it for about 10 years, but it ran out in 2004 and hasn't been re-implemented since then. It's something the president wants to happen, but it is a deeply divisive issue, the issue of gun rights. Largely we see the Republicans in support of gun rights, largely we see the Democrats like the President Joe Biden against it, and it comes up every election, and as you mentioned, it will be an election issue as we head into 2024. We're likely to see it once again on the ballot, with potential voters out there considering it as they cast their vote for the president next November.
Right, on that note, Nick Harper in Washington, D.C., thank you for your inputs, appreciate it. And staying in the Indo-Pacific, United Nations Nuclear Agency, the IAEA, has endorsed Japan's plan to release treated radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean. An earthquake and tsunami on 11th March 2011 had destroyed the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant's cooling systems, causing 3 reactors to melt and their cooling water to be contaminated and leak continuously. Now the IAEA says the release of the treated radioactive wastewater into the sea would only cause negligible environmental and health impacts.
Japan has won approval on Tuesday from the UN's nuclear watchdog IAEA for its plan to release treated radioactive water from tsunami-wrecked Fukushima plant into the ocean, despite fierce resistance from Beijing and some local opposition. Following the 2-year review, the International Atomic Energy Agency said Japan's plans were consistent with international safety standards and that they would have a negligible radiological impact to people and the environment.
The plan, as it has been proposed and devised, is in conformity with the agreed international standards, and its application, if the government decides to proceed with it, would have negligible impact on the environment, meaning the water, fish and sediment.
Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida assured that Japan will provide all explanations to the international community based on scientific evidence and with high level of transparency.
As a responsible leader of the international community, I have repeatedly stated that I will not allow a discharge that would have a harmful impact on human health and the environment of both Japan and the world. Japan will continue to provide explanations to the Japanese people and to the international community in a sincere manner, based on scientific evidence and with a high level of transparency.
IAEA Chief Rafael Grossi is going to visit the Fukushima plant on Wednesday. After his Japan trip, he will head to South Korea, where consumers have been snapping up sea salt and other items ahead of the water release. Newsnight Desk, DD India.
Right, moving on, the 31-member NATO on Tuesday decided to extend its Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg's contract by 1 year. In doing so, the transatlantic alliance opted to stick with an experienced leader as war rages between Ukraine and Russia. Stoltenberg, a former Prime Minister of Norway, has been the NATO chief since 2014. His tenure had already been extended 3 times. Stoltenberg has guided the NATO through a series of crises, most recently rallying NATO members in support of Ukraine while seeking to prevent the war there from escalating into a direct conflict between NATO and Russia. To West Asia now, at least 9 people are dead and dozens more wounded as Israeli forces raided the West Bank city of Jenin in what's been seen as the biggest Israeli military operation in decades. Sarah Coates reports.
Children's screams and the sound of stun grenades pierce the night as thousands of Israeli troops, tanks and bulldozers move into the city of Jenin, forcing hundreds of families to flee.
We came here to the hospital. They let us leave our houses. Someone used the ambulance headphones and told us to leave the house as the soldiers were standing near the ambulance and they knew that we had to leave.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is defending the raid as a counter-terrorism measure.
We will continue with this operation as long as required to restore calm and security to the people of Israel.
Denounced as a new war crime by Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, who's appealing to world leaders to intervene. The Palestinian Authority saying long-standing security agreements with Israel are now void.
In the light of the Israeli non-compliance of the Sharm el-Sheikh understandings, the leadership announces that these understandings no longer have any value and cease to exist.
Diplomats and world leaders are urging restraint.
We do see an urgent need for all parties to avoid further escalation in the West Bank. We do, as I said earlier, support Israel's right to self-defense and condemn the recent terrorist attacks unequivocally, but want to see the protection of civilians in all cases.
As protests in Gaza and neighbouring Jordan intensify, with Amman calling for any remaining ties with Israel to be terminated.
And staying in the region, stops closed down and streets were empty as Palestinians strike in the Israel-occupied West Bank and Jerusalem to protest against the Israeli military operation in Jenin. UN aid agencies voiced alarm at the scale of the operation. Israel defended its actions by saying that the raid in Jenin aims to uproot Iranian-backed Palestinian armed factions who were allegedly behind a recent surge in gun and bomb attacks. Moving on, Hong Kong police on Monday placed $130,000 bounties on 8 democracy activists who are in self-imposed exile. Human rights groups and Western governments condemned the move. After leaving Hong Kong in recent years, some activists have continued to speak out against what they claim is Beijing's crackdown on their city's freedoms and autonomy.
Hong Kong police on Monday accused 8 overseas-based activists of serious national security offences, including foreign collusion and incitement to secession, and offered rewards for information leading to their arrest.
And since the implementation of the national security law of Hong Kong, our department has totally arrested 260 individuals. And the most of them, the offense is committed by them is occurred in Hong Kong. But I would like to draw attention to a situation that some people have fled overseas and continue to engage in the activities and endangers the national securities. I would like to point out one point, that is the national security law of Hong Kong has an extraterritorial effect.
Hong Kong Chief Executive John Lee said on Tuesday 8 overseas-based Hong Kong activists who were issued with arrest warrants for alleged national security offences would be pursued for life.
Our action is to tell everybody that endangering national security is not something we will tolerate. We will do whatever legally to pursue the responsible person. How overseas politicians or officials say will not in any way change our strong belief in the need to uphold our protection of national security. I know that they have been doing things for their own political reasons, for their own political gains.
The accused are activists Nathan Law, Anna Kwok and Finn Lau. Former lawmakers Dennis Kwok and Ted Hui, lawyer and legal scholar Kevin Yam, unionist Mung Siu Tat and online commentator Yuan Gong Yi. The activists are based in several countries including the United States, Britain and Australia. They are wanted under a national security law that Beijing imposed on Hong Kong in 2020. World Today Desk, DD India.
The UK has called for the expansion of the UN Security Council's permanent seats to include India, Brazil, Germany and Japan, as well as the continent of Africa. Britain's ambassador to the United Nations and the President of the Security Council for the month of July, Barbara Woodward's comments came as she briefed UN correspondents on the program of work of the Security Council for the month. Woodward referred to remarks by British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly last week, in which he announced the UK's ambition to drive forward reform of the multilateral system. Woodward said the UK's presidency of the Security Council in July marks the first step in that process. In France, a relative calm after 5 nights of rioting offered some relief to the government of President Emmanuel Macron in its fight to regain control of the situation. Now, this just months after the widespread protests over an unpopular pension reform and a year out from hosting the 2024 Paris Olympics.
Days after riots, France is gradually limping back to normalcy. French Prime Minister Elisabeth Borne said on Monday the government's priority after a week of riots over the police shooting of a teenager was to restore Republican order.
Today our priority is to ensure the return of Republican order with the kind of order maintained tonight and with a strong criminal response.
Addressing the media after meeting with party leaders, she said the time for reflection on what happened when police shot dead 17-year-old Nahel in the suburb of Nanterre last Tuesday.
What makes me sad is that there is a young man who died a week ago, and once again, no lesson has been learnt by this government, and that unfortunately, this situation risks being repeated.
Citizens and officials gathered on the 3rd of July in the French town of La Haye-les-Roses after the mayor's family home was attacked. The mayor, Vincent John Brun, led the march along with other right-wing mayors and officials.
We have seen the true face of the rioters, that of assassins. Prevented from burning down the town hall, symbolic of the Republic, they redirected their hatred by resorting to a despicable act. They wanted to murder my wife and our 2 young children to their sleep and burn them alive by trying to burn down our house.
French Justice Minister Eric Moretti called for a tough response to rioters.
I asked for systematic presentation to a judge. I did ask that prosecutors require security measures of imprisonment, and that was the case this weekend. Each time people are targeted, of course, I remind you that there are a lot of injuries among the police, among elected officials. I remind you that a security guard was almost burned alive at the local court of Asnieres, where I went, that prison officers were victims of shooting and that they owe their life and their salvation only to the thickness of a pane of glass. So all of these are crimes and can be qualified as such. I asked for a firm response, and a firm response also for the most serious damage to property.
The relative calm following 5 nights of heavy riots offered some relief to the government of Emmanuel Macron in its fight to regain control of the situation just months after widespread protests over an unpopular pension reform and a year out from hosting the Olympics. The death of Nahel, a 17-year-old with Algerian and Moroccan parents, has stoked long-standing complaints of discrimination, police violence and systemic racism among law enforcement, denied by authorities, from rights groups and within the low-income, racially mixed suburbs that ring major French cities. World Today Desk, DD, India.
French President Emmanuel Macron says he believes the peak of rioting across the country has passed after a week of violence. He told as much on Tuesday to a meeting of more than 200 mayors from areas that have been affected by the unrest. The protests have been sparked by the fatal shooting of a teenager called Nahel at a traffic stop near Paris on 27th of June. However, the French president says he still remained cautious. Macron says he had invited the mayors to thank them for the action they had taken in recent days. More than 100,000 people in Cuba's capital, Havana, are without water as the heat of the Caribbean summer sets in. It's raised tensions on the city as the government scrambles to find a solution. The water shortage is linked to the island's aging infrastructure. State-run media reported last week that it has affected up to 200,000 people in the city, which is about 10% of Havana's population. Now, water shortages are caused by a variety of factors, including faulty motorized pump stations, leaky pipes, and climate change-induced drought. In some news from India now, a G20 meeting on research and innovation initiative gathering concluded in Mumbai on Tuesday. India's Secretary of the Department of Science and Technology, Dr. S. Chandrasekhar, chaired the meeting. The earlier meetings discussed about themes such as bioeconomy, blue economy and sustainable economy. My colleague Shyama Mishra spoke to Dr. Chandrasekhar. Take a listen.
Secretary, Department of Science and Technology, Dr. Srivari Chandrasekhar is with us. He's also the chair of RIIG. So the summit has begun today in Mumbai, and we understand this is just before the research ministers meeting. What's the agenda for today, and how are you proceeding?
Firstly, greetings to all of you, and I'm so happy that the RIIG summit for the minister meeting, pre-meeting today, has completed successfully. Actually, this is a culmination of 4 events which we had on various themes, including bioeconomy, blue economy, sustainability. So we are happy that all the discussions we had in the last 4 meetings, we all were able to come to some consensus. We made the ministerial declaration, and I do believe that tomorrow when all the ministers meet, it will be formally announced.
So you spoke about the various themes that we have covered throughout the meetings that were held at various parts of India. Understanding that, and you also you have contributed greatly through your contributions. So what are the challenges and what are the opportunities that the world faces in terms of research and innovation, and how can India take a lead in this?
Today, if you look at whatever you're talking of revolutions of industry, it's all because of science and innovation. So certainly this is one of the finest meetings amongst all the G20 get-togethers, where all the G20 nations have been talking on how we collaborate on research, especially for sustainable planet. We also know that the theme of us has been Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam.
So that was Dr. Chandrasekhar talking about the various themes that India has been discussing with the member countries and invited countries and IOs throughout India's G20 presidency for the theme and for the science and innovation sector, and also how it's going to be beneficial for the entire planet. With camera person Kapil Maske, this is Shama Mishra for DD India, Mumbai.
And in more news from South Asia, Sri Lanka's State Minister of Finance, Shihan Semasinghe, says the country has received the first installment of a World Bank loan amounting to $250 million. It's part of a larger agreement worth a total of $500 million in budgetary support and $200 million in welfare support. The loan will be released in 2 installments. It's tied to certain conditions set by the International Monetary Fund. Sri Lanka will receive these funds through the World Bank's concessionary International Development Association window. Last year, Sri Lanka defaulted on its external debt. India announced a humanitarian assistance of $4 billion to keep the island nation afloat. India was also the first creditor nation to have given financing assurances in line with IMF standards, which was essential for the $3 billion IMF bailout for Sri Lanka. From South Asia to South America now, Peru's most active volcano, the Ubinas, had 2 ash explosions on Tuesday, resulting in an ash column up to 5,500 meters high. The Environment Ministry said the ash was dispersed by winds towards the southern and southeastern sectors of the Ubinas volcano, which had been dormant since 2019. The ash following the explosion during the early hours of the morning affected populated communities in the districts of Ubinas and Matalac. In Tiruvaya, shelter houses have been set up in case of a volcanic emergency. And with that, it's a wrap. But news continues here on DD India. You can catch all the latest updates on our social media, mobile and digital platforms. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.